Next, we'll take a look at inside of the skull. This skull has been cut to show the floor of the cranium. There are two big steps in the floor, formed by the sphenoid ridge here and the petrous temporal bone here. These divide the floor of the cranial cavity into three parts: the anterior cranial fossa, the middle cranial fossa, and the posterior cranial fossa. We saw the posterior cranial fossa with the occipital bone. In this section, we'll look at the main features of the anterior cranial fossa and the middle cranial fossa. The bone that forms this bulge in the floor of the anterior cranial fossa is the same bone that forms the roof of the orbit. Here, this is the frontal bone. This crest in the midline of the anterior cranial fossa is the crestaria line. On either side of it is the depression, the base of which is formed by these areas of thin perforated bone, the cribriform plate. The cribriform plate forms the roof of the nose. In this side here, we can see it from below. The filament of the olfactory nerves come out of these cribriform plate. This flat area behind the cribriform plate is the roof of the sphenoid sinus. Now we move to the middle cranial fossa, the bone that forms the side wall and the floor of the middle cranial fossa also forms on the outside of the skull the wall of the temporal fossa and of the infratemporal fossa. We have seen that this is the roof of the orbit. The bone that forms the anterior wall of the middle cranial cavity also forms a part of the orbit. It forms this posterior part of the lateral orbital wall. This is the sella turcica in the middle. The deep depression in the sella turcica is the pituitary fossa for the pituitary gland. This shallow groove is for the optic nerve. This fossa has the anterior clinoid processes and the posterior clinoid processes. This sloping surface is the dorsum cilia, and it is continuous with the basilar part of the occipital bone. In the center of the middle cranial fossa, we have a lot of foramens, which we'll see in the later sections. Next, we'll be talking about the sphenoid bone. First, we'll see the sphenoid bone on the skull, then we'll see the sphenoid bone diagrammatically. Now we move on to look at the sphenoid bone. Sphenoid bone is extremely complex. It extends all the way from one side of the skull to the other side. The sphenoid bone forms an important part of the underside and the outside of the skull, and it forms the part of the orbit. The sphenoid bone also forms this large and complicated part of the floor of the cranium. Here is the sphenoid bone. Here we see the sphenoid bone separated. It has a central part, and on each side three major projections: the lesser wing, the greater wing, and the pterygoid processes. The central part of the sphenoid includes the clinoid processes and the pituitary fossa. The central part of the sphenoid bone is hollow. The lesser wing, which is the highest part of the sphenoid ridge, forms the sphenoid ridge. This sphenoid ridge separates the anterior cranial fossa and the middle cranial fossa. Underside of the lesser wing forms the small but important part of the back of the orbit. The greater wing of the sphenoid forms the front wall and the part of the floor of the middle cranial fossa. On the outside, the greater wing forms this part of the temporal and the infratemporal fossa. And it also forms this large part of the lateral part of the orbital wall. The greater wing and the lesser wing are joined here. More medially, they are separated by this triangular gap, the superior orbital fissure, which forms large opening between the orbit and the cranium. Here is the superior orbital fissure from the inside. The pterygoid process of the sphenoid bone project downwards behind the maxilla. Here they project downwards behind the maxilla. Pterygoid processes include the lateral pterygoid process and the medial pterygoid plates, which are the attachment for the important muscles. This hollow between the two plates is called as the pterygoid fossa. And this little hook here is the pterygoid hamulus, which acts as pulley for important muscles. Next, we'll see the sphenoid bone diagrammatically. Here in this diagram, we can see the lesser wing. Here in this diagram, we can see the lesser wing. This border of the lesser wing forms a sphenoid ridge that separates the anterior cranial fossa and the middle cranial fossa. In blue color here, we can see the greater wing. This greater wing forms the floor of the middle cranial fossa. It also forms the anterior wall. This is the anterior wall. This is the lateral wall, and it forms a floor. This greater wing has three important foramens. This is the foramen rotundum. This larger foramen is foramen ovale, and this small foramen is foramen spinosum. The relation of these foramens is an important source of MCQs. If you see here, this foramen is the optic foramen, and here in between this lesser wing and the greater wing, this region is the superior orbital fissure. This is the sella turcica. This is the sulcus for the optic nerve. These are the two pterygoid plates. So this is the lesser wing, this is the greater wing. This is the superior orbital fissure. Note the sequence of the foramen. If you notice the lateral pterygoid plate, it forms approximately a 90-degree angle with the opposite side lateral pterygoid plate. But if you see the medial pterygoid plates, they are parallel to each other. The sphenoid bone is a bat-shaped bone. It articulates with 12 bone. It is a complicated bone. It articulates with 4 single bone, the vomer, the ethmoid, the frontal and the occipital, and 4 paired bone, the parietal, temporal, zygomatic and the palatine. In this diagram, we can see the sphenoid bone inside the cranial cavity. This is the lesser wing, this is the greater wing, and these are the foramens. And this is the junction wherein it forms a foramen lacerum. Let's see the facial bones. This is the frontal bone, this is the zygomatic, this is the maxilla, this is the sphenoid bone, and this is the ethmoid bone. The frontal bone is a very large bone. The lower part of the frontal bone forms the beginning of the root of the nose. The upper part of the frontal bone forms the orbital margin and a small part of the temporal fossa and a large part of the roof of the orbit. If we see from inside the cranial cavity, frontal bone also forms most of the floor of the anterior cranial fossa. The part of the bone near the midline is hollow. These are frontal sinuses. Next, we look at the zygomatic bone. The zygomatic bone follows the bony prominence of the cheek. It also forms the lower lateral part of the orbital margin and this part of the lateral orbital wall. The zygomatic extends backwards to meet the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, forming the zygomatic arch. Now we move forwards and look at the maxilla. Here is the maxilla. The right and the left maxilla are joined together in the midline. On each side, maxilla forms the lower medial part of the orbital margin and almost all of the floor of the orbit. The maxilla bears the upper teeth on the underneath. It forms much of the hard palate. Maxilla is hollow. It contains the largest paranasal sinus, the maxillary sinus. To see the posterior of the maxilla, we'll remove the zygomatic arch. Here is the back of the hollow part of the maxilla. Here the maxilla is joined to the bone behind it, the sphenoid bone. Apart from this attachment, the maxilla is separated from this sphenoid bone by this impressive cleft, which has a vertical part and a horizontal part. The vertical part of the cleft is called the Pterygo-maxillary Fissure. The horizontal part of the cleft is called the inferior orbital fissure. Inferior orbital fissure, here is it from the front, separates the floor of the orbit formed by the maxilla from the lateral wall that is formed by the sphenoid. The next large bone we'll be talking about is the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone is little hard to understand, as in the intact skull, most of it is hidden from the view. The only part of the ethmoid bone that we can see clearly is the small part in the floor of the anterior cranial fossa, the two cribriform plates with the crista galli in between, and this part in the medial wall of each orbit. The rest of the ethmoid bone can be better viewed through the nasal cavity. We'll see the rest of the ethmoid bone with the nasal cavity. The ethmoid bone articulates with 15 bones, 4 in the cranium, the frontal, the sphenoid, the 2 sphenoid conchae, the 11 of the face, 2 nasal, 2 maxillary, 2 lacrimal, 2 palatine, 2 inferior nasal concha, and the vomer. This is the nasal bone, this is the lacrimal bone. The 2 thin nasal bone form just the upper part of the bridge of the nose. The structural support for the projecting part of the nose are made up of cartilage, which we will see later. The little lacrimal bone forms most of the medial part of the inferior orbital margin. This opening between the lacrimal bone and the ethmoid bone is the opening for nasolacrimal duct that takes tears from the eyes to the nose. Last of all, we'll look at the palatine bone. On each side of the palatine bone forms the posterior part of the hard palate and the part on the side of the wall of the nasal cavity, the horizontal and the vertical. We will look at the 3 openings that pass forward, 2 openings that pass downwards, and 1 that in spite of appearances pass obliquely backwards. We'll start with the ones that pass forward. This round opening just in front of the anterior clinoid fosses is the optic canal, through which goes the optic nerve. Lateral to this is this large triangular opening, the superior orbital fissure, which we have seen already. Numerous nerves and blood vessels pass through it into the orbit. Below and behind the medial end of superior orbital fissure is this small round opening, the foramen rotundum. It is for the maxillary nerve. We'll put this pointer in foramen rotundum and go round to the outside. Here is the superior orbital fissure again. Here medial to it is the optic canal. The foramen rotundum emerges not into the orbit but into the pterygo-maxillary fissure. The 2 openings that pass downward are foramen ovale for the mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve, and behind and lateral to it is the foramen spinosum for the middle meningeal artery. To see where these two come out, we'll go around the underside. Here is the foramen ovale, just behind and lateral to the pterygoid plate. Here is the foramen spinosum. The last opening to look at is this untidy looking opening, the foramen lacerum for the internal carotid artery. In the dry skull, the appearance of foramen lacerum is quite misleading. It appears to pass straight down, emerging here at the tip of the petrous temporal bone. But in the living body, the apparent opening on the underside is filled with the cartilage and the fibrous tissue. The fibrous tissue also fills in this part of the internal bone opening. What's left of the foramen lacerum is a clear-cut opening through which internal carotid artery emerges from its oblique bony tunnel, the carotid canal. The other end of the carotid canal is back here, just medial to the styloid process. In front of the opening for carotid canal is one more opening, the opening for the auditory tube, also called as the eustachian tube. Auditory tube passes backwards and laterally to emerge here in the middle ear. The auditory tube is longer than this. Medially, it's prolonged by the tube of cartilage, which you can see here. The auditory tube opens in the nasopharynx, which we'll be discussing later. With this, we complete our overview of the facial and the cranial bones. Now we can associate our knowledge with the text. Now whenever we are reading the text, please refer back the diagrams and try to imagine back the videos which we have seen. Do not hesitate to play this video again, pause it in between, review it again to have better understanding of things. As we proceed to the muscles and the other areas of anatomy, we will be revising these bones many times ahead. Thank you.